Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and the card dump has happened. We've seen all of the remaining Boomsday Project cards, and I'm gonna review all of them in part 12 here of my card review. That's right, more than 50 cards to talk about. So I'm gonna do my best to go quickly. That said, if you just want to see the cards, you can still hit the quick reviews link in the description and jump right to that. Otherwise, let's go into these still moderately quick detailed reviews. So up first here we have Floop's Glorious Gloop, the legendary spell for Druid. We've been waiting on this one a while, and it's a pretty cool spell. I don't know that it's going to work for everybody all the time, but the idea here is turning minion deaths into extra mana. So for instance, if you cast Floop's Glorious Gloop, which needs to happen first, and then you trade in a bunch of tokens into your opponent's tokens, you can get an accelerated mana for this turn only. So maybe you trade in 4 minions into 4 minions, you get 8 mana, and you can play a Lich King on, turn 2 or 3, for instance. Beyond that, this works with things like swipe as well. If you cast this, then you swipe down your opponent's board and clear 3 or 4 minions. You might get your swipe for free, essentially, and save some mana. So there are neat ways to use this thing, both reactively clearing minions, but also in a token style deck to do some sneaky things. The question for me is, how impactful is that single turn going to be compared to the more persistent mana ramp that we see in Druid that's more successful today? But honestly, at only 1 mana for Floop's Glorious Gloop, this can sometimes be perhaps like a super innervate in a way. A really cheap way to get tons more mana right now and infuse a lot of tempo into a turn. So I do think there's a lot of potential for this card. I have to think more about how to use it and what kind of decks are going to want to use it, but it does something strong enough that it could see some play. So now let's talk about Hunter's legendary spell, Florrick's Boomzuka, and I love the artwork for this one. It's an 8 mana spell, and in this one you summon 3 minions from your deck. They immediately start to attack enemy minions, presumably just at random, whatever thing they hit. They kill it, they attack the next thing, so on and so forth. But then at the end of the turn, those minions die. So, well, actually not even at the end of the turn necessarily. I think right away, in fact, if they survive the turn, they die. So the idea here is, I think, to synergize with big death rattle stuff, or little death rattle stuff even, but nonetheless, getting free trades off of your Savannah Highmanes and your Abominable Bowmans and your Seeping Oozlings and your Katharina Winterwisps and your Silver Vanguards, all of those death rattle pieces that we've already seen succeed in Hunter will work with Florrick's Boomzuka. Beyond that, this does actually serve as an interesting board clear option for Hunter, which they don't have a ton of right now, because if you do build your deck with big minions, you're likely going to clear a few different things off your opponent's side of the board, so it creates these big swing opportunities as well. A Katharina Winterwisp clearing a minion and then summoning a King Crush is a really good turn. Even for 8 mana, you're going to be happy with that. So it doesn't have to necessarily high roll super far to be a good turn. The bigger challenge for Florrick's Boomzuka is that it's only going to work in very specific kinds of decks. It's not going to be good unless your deck is built to support it. So it's not going to fit into every kind of Hunter by any means, but the right kind of deck, that Death Rattle synergy that we're already seeing pretty successfully, has a really good chance, I think, to play Florrick's Boomzuka successfully. And then up next here we have Harbinger Celestia, the last neutral legendary minion. This is a sweet looking character. She's a 4 mana 5/6 with stealth, a permanent stealth effect. We don't see that much in Hearthstone these days. But then it reads, after your opponent plays a minion, become a copy of it. So it's not really all that permanent, because all your opponent has to do to disrupt it is play a minion. And then Harbinger Celestia essentially turns into a minion mirror entity. And obviously that can backfire super hard if they summon a Firefly. It can high roll if they summon something big, but your opponent's going to know that you have Celestia on board, and you're going to be passing the initiative to them and say, look, you can use this card however you want. You can disrupt me. You can break my Celestia if they have the option to. So in some decks, they might not be able to play around Celestia very well. If for some reason they can't play a minion at all, you do get a 5/6 for 4 mana that can attack and still preserve its effect, which is kind of exciting. But a vast majority of the time, this thing's just going to backfire. It's going to fail. Your opponent will play around it perfectly, and there will be very, very little upside to the stats on this. So I think Harbinger Celestia is a really weak card. So next up here, we have the Coppertail Impostor. And sorry about the artwork on this one. I think I grabbed this before it was totally ready. But this is a new Mech, 4 mana 4/4. And Battlecry reads, gain stealth until your next turn. So this is a mech that you're more or less almost guaranteed to keep on the board. You know, this is one of those things your opponent's going to have a lot of difficulty clearing. They're certainly not going to want to use AoE against just a single 4/4, which is nice potentially for Mech magnetize style decks where they want to get something guaranteed to magnetize. It can set up a big burst damage combo, for instance, or just give you that defensive body on a future turn. Whatever it is you might need, Coppertail Impostor looks like a reasonable way to set that up. And frankly, its stat line's not that bad either for a one-turn stealth minion. There's just a lot of things you can do with this. The question is, of course, always going to be, though, is this better than other options? Is this good enough to carve out a spot in a deck? I have some questions there. I mean, it's got potential, but I don't think this is going to be an everyday mech by any means. So now let's move on to the Skater bot here. 1 mana, 1/1 mech with Magnetic and Rush. And I think this is actually a pretty cool little utility mech, just because being able to give any given mech Rush the turn you play it and putting it into that instant activation category as opposed to a passive category where most minions live is pretty powerful. The 1/1 buff is nothing to scoff at either for 1 mana that could help you take value trades. So I like this guy. He's not going to make the cut in every list because not every list is going to be able to afford to run a 1 mana card that may not be strong enough for more value control oriented lists. But if you're running an aggressive or mid-rangey list that wants to take a value trade with a cheap little guy, Skaterbot looks like the perfect enabler for that thanks to that Magnetic Rush combo. I think this will see a little bit of play. And then we have the Bronze Gatekeeper, and once again, I think this is an interesting utility mech that's really powerful with Magnetic, because much like Rush previously, this is just a big old pile of taunt stats, and being able to give your mechs taunt sometimes will be incredibly powerful, because some of them have death rattles you want to activate, sometimes you just need that defensive measure, and although as a 1/5 for 3, it's not super exciting on its own as a mech, it still creates a body that can be buffed in the future. But I think it's just that magnetic angle that's much more important for this one. It again gives any given mech in play some sort of instant relevance, where if you give it taunt, you're forcing action through it. And that's going to be important for mech decks, being able to make sure their mechs are impacting the game right away. Both Bronze Gatekeeper and Skaterbot look like they're going to do that, so I think this is another solid little mech that'll see some play. So up next here is Research Project for Mage, another project card, 2 mana spell. Each player draws 2 cards. So this is a Coldlight Oracle without legs, just a spell. And, you know, I don't think this one's going to see a whole lot of play. There's a lot of downside, of course, to giving your opponent 2 cards. And Mage has so many other ways to draw a ton of cards that Research Project won't necessarily be important for them, I don't think. Coldlight Oracle, as a neutral card, opened up so many different classes' abilities to infuse their hand with so much stuff, and there were mill options as well across different classes. Mage doesn't have mill options. They have plenty of card draw otherwise. I mean, Arcane Intellect would only be a 1 mana penalty here, and it wouldn't give your opponent a ton of stuff. So since there's no mill direction that I can visualize, since Mage is already good to go with card draw in a lot of different ways, they don't need this for hand Mage, for instance, I don't think Research Project's going to make a lot of sense right now. Maybe if a mill Mage down the road eventually became a thing, Research Project could make sense. And maybe if Mage didn't have as much card draw, it would be fine. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. I just don't see why you'd play it right now. So up next is Tinting Turin for Druid, a 6 mana 3/4 that reads, choose one, give your other minions +1/+1, or summon 2 2/2 tree ants. So we basically here have a little baby Cenarius minion, and although it's obviously not as good as Cenarius, it does come much cheaper, which I think is really interesting, because Cenarius, although a good card that has seen some play, is sometimes a little bit slow as a follow-up to token style boards. Like, you can play him if you get to turn 9, but sometimes he's hard to flex in with other things. For instance, you can't summon a ton of tokens and play Cenarius in the same turn. With Tinting Turin, you actually can. So I think there's a lot more flexibility here. Even though from a raw output standpoint it's worse, from a flexibility and mana cost standpoint, it seems to fit that game plan a lot better. So this can do 2 things, right? It can summon a token board, because you're going to get 3 minions for 6 mana, which is a nice little reload, and the total stat line as well is 7/8, which is pretty solid for 6 mana, which supports the archetype. But then also it's a follow-up card. You can give your wisps or tree ants or whatever it is +1/+1 as well. And because of that just ultimate flexibility here, I think this thing's going to see some play. It's not always going to be better than other options for token decks, but there's a list that will find a home for this just because it does something good and synergizes with what Druid likes really, really well. And although a 3/4 for 6 doesn't sound exciting, when there's so much value attached to it, this is a solid card. And then we have the Mechano Egg for Paladin, a 5-mana 0/5 mech, and the death rattle reads summon an 8/8 Robosaur. So clearly if this goes off like you want it to, you get a giant 8/8 minion for 5 mana, and you're pretty excited about that. The challenge for me with Mechano Egg is I think it's a little bit expensive for that egg style. I think eggs are much better when they come at that 2 or 3 mana cost, because they lead into buffs so much better, or at least other synergy cards like we see in Hunter today. But for Paladin specifically, if you can play an egg on 2 or 3 and you can lead it into, for instance, a Blessing of Kings, that's going to feel way better. Now, Mechano Egg does lead into Spike Ridge Steed, of course, on curve, but that's still not going to be as impactful of a play on turn 5 when you're just playing a 0/5. That doesn't feel all that good right off the bat. That said, because of the raw stat total, because this does synergize with buffs and it's easy to flip its health, Mechano Egg is probably still something that's going to see a little bit of play. Of course, also good with magnetic minions, but that's kind of what I mean when I say buffs. So I like this card okay. I don't think it's going to be a staple or define a deck or anything necessarily, but it certainly has some playability. And then up next here we have the Glowtron, a 1-mana 1/3 mech with magnetic. And this just looks like a little kind of throwaway mech here to me. Doesn't do much, right? No other effect other than magnetic. But as we've seen in the past, a 1-mana 1/3 can just be a very strong play. By God, Dire Mole sees play just as a straight 1-mana 1/3. So Glowtron has a chance, of course. As a mech, it can serve as that early start to a magnetic play where you put something on top of it. It can also, in a pinch, just serve as a little health buff that sets up a value trade, for instance, on other mechs. So not especially exciting, not a real power card when it comes to the mech set, but a good one. Very solid, reliable, playable sort of guy. So I think absolutely will be a part of any sort of Paladin mech deck that pops up. He is going to be a good way to open and an okay way to follow up with magnetic. So up next here is Weapons Project for Warrior, and I think this is a cool little project. You're giving your opponent a 2/3 weapon and 6 armor, which is fantastic, but of course in the right sort of environment, it's far less likely that your opponent actually benefits from that than you do. If you're playing a defensive deck, that 6 armor is going to matter more, and your 2/3 weapon will be much, much better at clearing little stuff. Now, the downside, of course, there is that sometimes this won't do much in a control versus control environment other than perhaps serve as weapon removal, so you'll have to decide, is this better than a Gluttonous Ooze or Acidic Swamp Ooze? But I think some of the times it will, and in certain metas in particular, this will just be really important as that kind of fiery War Axe style card that might be even better in a lot of ways, because your opponent's weapon, best case scenario, if you don't play minions, is it just removes your armor and you get a 2/3 weapon for 2 mana. And that's okay, right? Because that 6 armor eats the 2 attack times 3 that your opponent plays. So if you're not playing minions, there's really not much downside to giving them the weapon. And of course, the armor won't matter either if it's an aggro matchup, because you're going to win late with giant stuff or fatigue or whatever it else is anyway. So even the armor doesn't really give them much. So the downside seems bad, but it's actually not that impactful in the right sort of setting. That said, I think Weapons Project has some potential to see play. It's not going to be perfect all the time, but a solid card nonetheless. And then up next here, we have Spirit Bomb for Warlock, a nice 2-mana spell that deals 4 damage to a minion, but also hurts your hero. A bit like a Shadow Bolt, but at a discount with some health cost. And that said, I don't think you'd ever run this over Shadow Bolt in a control deck, but hey, if you're doing some kind of self-damage deck where you're trying to exploit all kinds of self-damage synergies, or play something like Hooked Reaver, for instance, and even Warlock, Spirit Bomb might make a whole lot of sense. Just that extra flexibility and the option to cheat out your damage stuff sooner is very powerful. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see this make the cut in something like an even Warlock or some other dedicated self-harm deck. It's got some utility there. And then up next here, we have the Crystallizer. Cool looking card artwork. 1-mana 1/3, as we've said. That works sometimes. And the battle cry reads, deal 5 damage to your hero and then gain 5 armor. Once again, this is another card that could work really well in a self-harm Warlock. Would not work in even Warlock, unfortunately, so that might limit its capabilities a little bit as we understand the meta today. But I also think this card has some interesting applications in Warrior. Warrior is a deck that likes armor far more than health, so that could be important. It might even be interesting in Priest a little bit, because Priest has trouble going above that 30 health limit, but is easily capable of healing their health total up. So if they're looking for an early minion to start buffing, for instance, in a, I don't know, Divine Spirit Inner Fire deck, then Crystallizer has some options. So is this going to see play for everybody? No, it's not going to be perfect for everybody because it's just a 1-mana 1/3. It wouldn't be better than Dire Mole necessarily, but in some classes, in some environments, this exists as an option. I don't think it's going to be good, but it's possible. And here we have some self-damage synergy for Warlock. The Nether Soul Buster, 3-mana 1/5 demon, Battlecry, gain +1 attack for each damage a hero is taken this turn. So this thing can't snowball like crazy if you're using the right kinds of cards. I mean, obviously in combination with Crystallizer, this very quickly becomes a 6/5 for 3 mana. That's intriguing. I mean, if that kind of deck works out, Nether Soul Buster is going to be a really important part of that. Beyond that, though, I don't think Nether Soul Buster is going to see play in any sort of traditional Warlock. Just a life tap, for instance, isn't exciting enough for me with Nether Soul Buster, because if you're life tapping and playing this at the same turn, that's 5 mana, and a 3/5 on 5 mana is just not exciting enough. If you could get this out consistently on turn 3 as a 3/5 or a 5/5, that would make more sense. So I think there's some awkwardness with actually getting this card out fast enough for those attacks to be important enough, but nonetheless still has some possible utility in that deck. Specifically could be great. If you're able to get it out on 4 as a 6/5, for instance, that is really, really strong. So it has some possibilities, just not going to be consistent necessarily or included across a lot of different deck types. So up next here, let's talk about Soul Infusion, a new spell for Warlock at 1 mana. It's essentially a hand buff that gives +2/+2 to a specific minion in your hand. And although this is a reasonable buff for this cost, I think the awkwardness of this having to target a specific thing in a specific spot in your hand to really get the maximum value, so essentially something that duplicates, which Warlock has a few such cards, the Duplicating Imp, I think it's called now, and the Omega Agent, perhaps. That means it's going to be like a dead card sometimes, so you're waiting for that super heavy-hitting thing, and otherwise you're going to feel bad casting it. So it's fine, it seems like it's going to be awkward, and unless your deck is built very specifically to utilize this, it's going to be a fairly weak return on your investment on average, and who knows if that deck's actually going to succeed. So at the very best, I think just an average card. And it's apparently called the Doubling Imp, not the Duplicating Imp, but you guys get the idea. Here's the Doubling Imp, which is used with our last card pretty successfully. If you could turn this into 2 3/3s for 3 mana, that's really exciting. You've also got Keleseth buffs, which can hit this thing and make it 2 3/3s. It's essentially got that exact Serenite Chain Gang sort of vibe, but of course a demon and not taunt. That's at only 3 mana, and you get 4/4 in total stats of this thing for a base level, which is not too bad for Zoo. Just getting a couple bodies onto the board on turn 3 is solid, and then the upside with buffs and other crazy synergies, I think makes this better. Now, I don't think this is run in every version of Zoo, but I do think it's solid enough in a demon build in particular that might work out with Void Analyst in the future, that this is certainly the kind of card that can see some play eventually. And then here we have the Explodinator, a 4-mana 3/2 mech in the neutral set that summons 2 0/2 Goblin Bombs. And if you don't remember, Goblin Bombs do 2 damage to the enemy hero when they die. So this gets you 3 mechs on board for only 4 mana, that kind of tiny mini Dr. Boom style of old. And that's not terrible just to give you stuff to work with. I don't know if there's going to be a successful Goblin Bomb deck. They're these, really aggressively styled eggs, essentially. But if a hunter or somebody can use a lot of Goblin Bombs successfully and use magnetic buffs, this has got some fringe playability. I don't think it's going to be good on average just because most of the time it's a 3/2 that has a very late payoff with these death rattles from the Goblin Bombs, but other times it might just be a big pile of bodies that are important. So not good most of the time, but fringe playability. And then up next here we have an interesting card for Priest, Test Subject, 1 mana 0/2, and when this guy dies, it returns any spells you cast on it to your hand. And I gotta be honest, I think this card's intriguing. It's far better to me than Primal Fin Champion, a very similar card we saw in the past for Paladin, primarily because it's a lot cheaper at 1 mana versus 2, and that may not sound a lot cheaper, but it just allows you to get things started off so much more quickly. And there are some 3 mana buffs in particular for Priest, and of course Divine Spirit on turn 2 and Power Word Shield, and there's enough that it might make this thing worth it. And frankly, even just a Power Word Shield hitting this occasionally is going to give you a lot of extra cycle and a little body to build on and heal and play around with any sort of Inner Fire style deck. So I don't know, I mean, this is obviously not the kind of card that's played in every Priest deck, but in a specific build designed to run this, it seems like a really nice starter and could get that deck moving and give it that foundation that's necessary. So I do think this card has some playability. Speaking of buffs, we have Extra Arms, far and away the best name ever for a card. This 3-mana buff for Priest gives a minion +2/+2, and it adds a more arms to your hand. That also gives the minion +2/+2. So a big pile of buffs you can cast here. Now +2/+2 for 3 is not great, but the value return here is nice. That you get a second card and a second chance to buff. The problem is it's still going to be a little bit slower than something like Unidentified Elixir, for instance, which gives you the same buff at the same cost, but also often impacts the board more directly, although probably only half the time, really. But nonetheless, a very similar card along that same vein. Great with our previous card, Test Subject, but again, it's going to have to go into a specific deck, I think, for it to make sense. Also not terrible, I suppose, with Zarek. Master Cloner, the legendary for Priest, but that's still awfully slow. So playable card, looks fine, has a lot of stuff in there. It's just not going to be an everyday sort of thing. And then up next here we have Astral Rift for Mage, a new spell that adds 2 random minions to your hand for 2 mana. And that's nice. You turn 1 card into 2, but unfortunately random minions are exactly that. They're random, and on average they're going to be terrible in things that don't synergize and things that don't do anything. So the high roll potential here is incredibly limited, and you wouldn't want to sacrifice a card in your deck for, you know, a 1 in 100 chance to give you something awesome. So I don't think Astral Rift is going to see much play at all. Not even in like a hand mage deck where you're trying to get extra cards. This really only adds 1 extra card to your hand, so it doesn't even help that much. There are going to be better options. I don't know who runs this card or why, so to me this one's just not going to see any play. And then up next here we have Bomb Toss for Hunter, and yet another Goblin Bomb card that seems like that's going to be a thing for Hunter. This one does 2 damage for 2 mana as a spell, which, you know, that's not too bad. It's that Frostbolt, Dark Bomb sort of thing, a little worse because it's 2 damage instead of 3, but nonetheless still gives you the ability to swing the board almost in a flanking strike style, but earlier in the game, killing those Knife Jugglers, Flame Imps, etc. And you know what? That's not bad. And then again, if you can utilize those Goblin Bombs for damage or as mech bodies and bases, I think this card could absolutely see play in a mech deck. It makes a lot of sense just to give you the body and address the board. So I think this does a good thing. Is it necessarily going to work? No, because Goblin Bombs may not be a thing. But nonetheless, the core components of this card make sense and operate in a positive way, so I do think it has potential. And then up next here we have Secret Plan, a 1-mana card for Hunter that just allows you to discover a secret. And you know what? I think this is totally fine. You know, it's a good return. We've seen other cards like this in the past. You get an unpredictable secret, which is nice, because otherwise, often against Hunter, you kind of know exactly what secrets you're playing against. This can allow you to do things like empower that spellstone without giving your opponent any sort of informational advantage, or you could just run more secrets if you wanted to for some reason as well. So I like it fine. I don't think it's going to see a whole lot of play for the record. I think you're probably just better off running the secrets you want and finding room for other things in your deck, but that doesn't make this unplayable. Fine card, has opportunity. And then up next here we have the Necro Mechanic, another Death Rattle synergy card for Hunter, 5 mana, 3/6. Okay stat line, not super exciting for 5, but has some survivability, which is nice. And the fact that your Death Rattles trigger twice, there's a lot of upside to that effect. That can lead to lots of burst damage, lots of big bodies on board. It works with a deck that's already being played in Hearthstone, so all of that's pretty exciting. Now, the question for this card is it going to be better than other alternatives? Can you make room for it in a deck list that's already pretty refined? Because it doesn't do a lot necessarily on its own. It has to be synergizing with something else or being played with something else or coming down when you already have Death Rattles on board. So there are some challenges for this card to me, but I think because its effect is big enough and scales so well across multiple different kinds of things that Necro Mechanic will still probably be a card that sees some play. And then up next here I have the Dino Mattock for Warrior, a 5 mana 3/4 mech that deals 5 damage, randomly split among all minions except mechs. And I think this card's great for Warrior. It does exactly what Warrior wants to do in a mid-rangey mech style. It can hit things that Warrior wants to take damage, like Acolyte of Pain, Frothing Berserker, Armorsmith. Can also just clear minions off the board if you're playing against a faster deck and you're looking to swing. So although the stat line's not incredibly exciting for 5 mana, this effect is positive enough in multiple directions that this card will see some play. Up next here we have the Glowstone Technician for Paladin, and this is essentially just a hand buff card like we've seen long ago for Paladin in the mean streets of Gadgetzan, but frankly, I think it's way too slow, and the payoff here is not strong enough for it to make sense. We saw the same problem with hand buff in the past. It just takes a long time to put these stats into play, and the fact that this is a 6-mana card means it's coming down way late in the game when stats are less impactful in the first place. So this one's going to be hard to work with, really hard to squeeze into a deck. It doesn't match up with how it should work. If it was super cheap and did this, of course, you'd be way more excited about it. But at this expense, it's just not paying off nearly enough. You're not even going to have that many minions in hand sometimes by turn 6. So I don't see how this thing operates at all. This looks like a very weak and awkward card to me. Up next here, we have a Shaman spell, Elementary Reaction for 2 mana, and this is a very cheap card draw that essentially can high roll into multiple card draws. It's not even really a high roll because you can do it consistently as long as you're running an elemental deck, and you can wait to use it until you know it's going to work. And of course, having multiple instances of a resource in your hand are really good. Getting double Kalamos or double Alec here would be exciting, or even a double spell of some sort. You can start to chain this into another set of elementary reactions and just go infinite nearly. And that's cool because you can create lots of value. And elemental decks can certainly play a more slower value game. They don't have to be all about tempo, so I think this would fit in a lot of different shells. So does something good, has the chance to turn into some really cool plays, create opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist. This looks like a good card to me. Up next here, we have Goblin Prank for 2 mana for Hunter. It gives a friendly minion +3/+3 and rush, and then that minion dies at the end of the turn. And I actually think this card has some intriguing possibilities. First off, you can kind of look at it as a power overwhelming sort of card. Because remember, just because it gives a minion rush, if that minion's already on board and ready to attack, this can still just be a buff that goes face and gives you 3 additional damage on face. So it's almost like, a cheap 1-turn Blessing of Kings or something of a sort. So there's some potential there. Beyond that, the rush aspect is really nice too. You can give a minion from hand instant stats, take a value trade, use it for some sort of removal tool, etc. And then finally, the fact that it actually kills your minions can be important too, because in Death Rattle decks, it's not always easy to trigger your Death Rattles. If you play that Seeping Oozling or Silver Vanguard or whatever it might be, this can allow you to kill your Death Rattles in 2 ways. One, because it gives them rush, meaning they can take a trade instantly. Secondly, even if they take that value trade instantly with rush and they hang around on board, they're going to die at the end of the turn, activating your Death Rattle anyway. All of which can be pretty positive. So for instance, with an egg deck, if you cast this on Devilsaur Egg, you're going to get some great results. So I think Goblin Prank works in a couple different directions. It looks like it does everything you want. It's pretty efficient for its mana cost. This is a surprisingly caught me off guard kind of solid card as far as I'm concerned. And then up next here, we have the Holomancer neutral minion, 5 mana, 3/3. After your opponent plays a minion, summon a 1/1 copy of it. So this is another almost mirror entity sort of card where you discourage your opponent from playing something scary. But this one's really easy to play around because as long as they have any sort of minion without an effect, it doesn't even matter how big it is, right? They could play a 10-mana minion as long as the 1/1 version of it didn't matter. So there are a lot of different ways to play around this thing, even more so than mirror entities. So they could play a Firefly, they could also play a Tyrantus, and it probably wouldn't make any difference, right? So Holomancer to me looks really awkward, very expensive for its effect. The chance for it to add up a lot of value over the long term is very minimal. I just don't think this card's going to see any play. And then up next here, we have the Kaboom bot, neutral mech, 2/2 for 3 mana, Death Rattle reads, deal 4 damage to a random enemy minion. This guy's stats are fairly weak for a 3-drop. The Death Rattle here, is more about board control where you're removing something, but it's going to be awkward to use. Your opponent can play around it pretty smartly a lot of the time because they're going to have the decision on how this thing is killed. So I don't think this minion goes very far. I don't even really think it's a part of mech decks. There's so many other mechs to work with. This doesn't have magnetic or anything cool to put that Death Rattle into effect instantly. So I don't think this guy's going to see much play. And then up next here, we have the Loose Specimen, a 5 mana neutral minion. Looks like it's got an Elic and all kinds of different creatures there attached into one. That's horrifying. This is a beast, though, and its battlecry reads, deal 6 damage, randomly split among all other friendly minions. So I think the idea there is that you're getting a bit of an overstated minion here for some downside because you don't necessarily want to hurt your own minions and you might kill your own stuff because 6 damage is quite a bit to absorb with any given board. But if you play this on an empty board, you get an overstated guy. The problem there is this isn't as overstated as something like Bittertide Hydra. It's not as big as the Giants. So as a minion, I don't think it makes sense as a 5 mana 6/6 is just a big scary threat. Alternatively, you might want to use this in some sort of self-damage deck where you've got the Armor Smiths or the Acolytes or whatever else it might be. but typically those decks are working in a very specific fashion. It's not often damage oriented unless you think you can make this work with Frothing Berserker, which would be tough. So ultimately what that means is I don't really see how this makes sense in a control deck, an aggro deck. It just feels awkward. So I don't think this card's going to see play. It's not fundamentally terrible by any means. It just feels like who's going to want to use this and why. So up next here, let's talk about Mecca Ruh, a cute card. 1 mana, 1/1 neutral mech. And the death rattle here summons a 1/1 Joey bot. That's super cool. And this is essentially Possessed Villager, but in mechs. And I think the ability to get out a cheap 1-drop in a mech deck to get things started, hopefully keep a mech on board to set up for future magnetized plays is solid. So Mecca Ruh to me in a fast, aggressive mech style could certainly be a core part of getting off to a quick start and making sure you have those consistent mechs on board. Not an ultimately, super exciting card, but definitely one that has enough consistency and predictability that it will see some play. And then up next we have Steel Rager. We got another Rager, guys. That's exciting. 4 mana 5/1 mech with Rush. And frankly, I think this is the best Rager we've ever seen. Now, it does come at 4 mana, not 3 mana, sadly, but that still feels balanced to me because this is essentially a removal spell attached to a body. And that means you can push through lots of different minions with your Steel Rager. But on top of that, interestingly, you can play this in the same turn as another magnetized mech. Now, this doesn't have magnetized, but you can play it first. It has Rush, then magnetize something on top of it, and suddenly you might get to put that card's magnetized, whatever effect it might be, into play immediately as well. So even something like Ziliax, for instance, I know he has Rush, but this just gives you a huge attack base for Ziliax with Divine Shield for some kind of crazy options. Now, that's kind of the perfect scenario, fairly expensive scenario. So not every mech deck is going to want to run this. In fact, most won't. I think there are going to be more consistent options. But this card works really well in certain environments. It's the sort of thing coming off Dr. Boom might be good sometimes. It's going to be fine in Arena. So it has some interesting fundamental strengths that you don't typically see in a Rager because that Rush means it can trade up really quickly. So the best Rager we've seen yet, I would argue, and a somewhat promising card. So up next here we have the Spring Rocket. You guys won't be able to see this, but here's a spring. And this is a 3 mana 2/1 mech that reads Battlecry, deal 2 damage. So we've seen a card very similar to this in the past with Disciple of Cthulhu, which frankly felt like a pretty good card to play a lot of the time. It just gave you that swing on the board, you killed something and you played something. And because this has those mech synergies, it's going to be great to do that and then magnetize this with additional stats. So I think Spring Rocket looks like a playable card to me. This has some historical precedent, and the mech synergies open up a whole new world for it. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this thing make the cut in a mech deck. So up next here we have the Electro Right, a 3 mana 3/3 with a Battlecry. If you're holding a spell that costs 5 or more, gain +1/+1. And frankly, this card just seems at odds with itself. It's all about getting stats into play early, but to do that, you have to have some late game cards. And right now, there just aren't many decks that make sense there. Maybe like Bloodlust would be okay if you're running a Token Shaman. That would make a little bit of sense, but you're not always going to be holding that Bloodlust, and you have a 3 mana 3/3. So not a whole lot of upside here. Very challenging to actually achieve. And when you do achieve it, your deck probably doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So this looks like a weak throwaway card. I don't think this one's going to see any play. And then up next here, I have the Venom Iser, a 2 mana 2/2 magnetic poisonous mech for Hunter. And this one looks really promising. I think there's a lot of different ways to use this guy because of that poisonous. You can put it into effect immediately on small things like little goblin bombs, for instance. Trade those in, get the death rattle. That's going to be a positive interaction. Frankly, playing this as a 2/2 sometimes just on its own won't be absolutely terrible because it can create a lot of friction and problems for your opponent if they can't deal with it. 2 health, much harder to deal with than 1. So even on its own, it looks okay, but as a magnetic option, it looks great. So with all those goblin bombs out there, don't be surprised if Venom Iser absolutely sees some play. And then up next here, I have the Cloak Scale Chemist, a neutral minion, 2 mana 1/2 with Stealth and Divine Shield. And that's a really intriguing combo that's surprising on a low-cost neutral minion on dump day. I think this has some promising elements because this is a great base to build on for any sort of buff deck or deck that's trying to pull off shenanigans with stats. So a Zoo-style deck might be able to use this really successfully. We've seen that in the past with, minion-based decks with like a Noyatron, for instance. And Cloak Scale Chemist is an Noyatron that's almost certainly going to be there by the time you want to do something with it. So maybe there's a deck out there that runs buffs and is able to trade up with this thing and make it into a scary minion. Maybe even Rogue runs this somehow with like Cold Bloods to do tons of damage. I don't know, but the possibilities exist. So it's not going to be run by everybody, of course. It's not perfect, but it has opportunity, which is cool and surprising. So I like this card more than I expected. And then up next here is the Unpowered Maul, another neutral mech, 2 mana, 2/4. This time it can only attack if you've cast a spell this turn. And frankly, I think that's a pretty annoying downside that's going to be hard to overcome. Often you just don't want to play spells. And the upside here is very minimal. 2/4 for 2 is really not very exciting. So this will absolutely be left in the dust compared to other mechs. This is a throwaway card. This is never going to make the cut in constructed format. Moving on here, we have the Crazed Chemist for Rogue, a 5 mana 4/4, and combo, it gives a friendly minion +4 attack. And, you know, that's cool. You're decent stat line here for 5. You get some upside with a lot of potential damage. It's that Dark Iron Dwarf sort of line, and it's a permanent +4 attack. But when you compare this to other options, for me, it falls short. Frankly, it's probably worse than Dark Iron Dwarf in my mind in some ways. Cobalt Scalebane's probably better too in some ways, although that attack is not instant. It's just more pressure on the board. This has to combo, which can be awkward. It makes it more expensive really than 5 mana. You got to do something else with it unless it's exactly a backstab or prep or whatever. So although it's, you know, a cold blood on legs, basically, I think it's going to be far more awkward to utilize. You can't play it with Leroy, those sorts of things. So I think this card is going to fall short. And then up next here, we have a neutral minion, Toxicologist. 2 mana, 2/2, Battlecry, give your weapon +1 attack. Really nice little card. Simple, easy, but great for things like Kingsbane Rogue in particular. Any other weapon deck that's trying to go big in weapons somehow will use this thing. So no, not everybody's going to play this. It's not fitting into all kinds of decks, but it's the sort of thing that will pop up from time to time in a deck that needs exactly this. Specifically, I can almost guarantee you Kingsbane Rogues will want to run this because they like having extra attack buffs, and there's a limited pool right now. So Toxicologist looks just fine. And then up next here, we have the Damaged Stegatron, which is an awesome name. 6 mana, 5/12 mech with Taunt. And the Battlecry reads deal 6 damage to this minion. So vast majority of the time when you play this from hand, it's a 6 mana, 5/6 Taunt. That's not very exciting. But if you can put this into play without the Battlecry somehow, it's a little better as a 5/12. That's that Sleepy Dragon sort of line. So the question is, who recruits this? How do they recruit it? And is it better than alternatives? And I think all of those questions are pretty hard to answer. There's not obvious answers to me there. So to me, this card does not look like it's going to see a whole lot of play. The synergies just aren't there. There are other options that exist. So I'm not sure why you'd be playing Damaged Stegatron, which is a shame because I like the name a lot. And then up next here, we have Ecto Man C4 Warlock, a 6 mana spell that reads summon copies of all the demons you control. So basically, if you have, 3 demons on board, you can copy 3 of those same demons. And admittedly, that's pretty good with Doom Guards. It's not too bad with Void Lords either, because you get all these crazy demons. But that said, if you have 3 Doom Guards on board, you're probably already winning the game. The same can be said for Void Lords. So this is one of those follow-up win more cards that doesn't actually probably help you win all that much more. So in other words, there's a great opportunity cost here when you could be running something else that contributes to a game plan, contributes to your survivability, does something else in a pinch, as opposed to only works in these really specific scenarios. So worse than things like Bloodlust, right, which just help you end the game. This doesn't necessarily do that. So it's not good with fast decks. If you summon 3 extra Flame Imps, that probably doesn't matter. They're all going to die to the same Blizzard anyway, right? So to me, this card looks awkward to use. I don't know who's wanting to run it or why. Maybe in some kind of cheesy, charge combo deck, it makes a little bit of sense. So it's not totally awful, but still not going to see a lot of play. And then up next here, we have Topsy-Turvy for Priest, a new 0 mana spell. Swap a minion's attack and health. And that's super intriguing. This is an effect we've seen successfully played before with things like Crazed Alchemist, Void Ripper, and at 0 mana, Topsy-Turvy becomes very, very intriguing for Priest, because now you don't even really need Inner Fire necessarily in a Divine Spirit deck. If you're looking to just outright kill your opponent with burst damage, you can run a 0 mana Topsy-Turvy. So 2 things can happen. That can become a cheaper, faster combo, but it can also be a more redundant combo if you want, because now you have another way to cheese out that high health into lots of damage. So that's a really interesting possibility for this card and how it could be played. It's also just a great effect against totems and doomsayers and other sorts of things. So I'm not sure how often Priest is going to actually put this into a deck list, but the fact that this exists off of card generation stuff like Lyra is going to be impactful at some point or another. So a very neat little card, a 0 mana spell, which is hard to design, but I think the power level on this is quite promising. And then up next here we have the Micro Tech Controller, a 3 mana 2/1 with a battle cry that reads summon 2/1/1 micro bots. And you know what? That's a decent little board for 3 mana. You get 3 minions. A couple of them are mechs, which are interesting for mech synergies. But at the end of the day, I'm worried that, you know, in total, you're only summoning 3 health, all of which dies to pings or easy AoEs. So how far are all of these minions going to go? And more importantly, are there just better options for you to get stats into play with a 3 mana card? And I would say probably so. So at the end of the day, not by any means an unplayable card. It does something you like, but still better options are going to exist. So I think this will fall to the wayside. So let's move on to the Piloted Reaper. That's a super cool looking Piloted Shredder clone here. This is a 4 mana 4/3 mech, that's familiar. And the death rattle reads, summon a random minion from your hand that costs 2 or less. So very much in that Piloted Shredder nostalgia line here, which is neat, but not nearly as good as Piloted Shredder in my mind. And I'll tell you why that is. It's because a lot of the time I think this death rattle is actually going to backfire. Because if you're playing this thing on turn 4, what have you spent the last 3 turns doing? You spent the last 3 turns playing your 1s and your 2-drops. And the odds of you having a 2-drop in hand by turn 4 are far more limited than you'd like. Occasionally it's going to hit, right? Often you'll have a 2-drop still, or you could even save a 2-drop, but then you're creating friction with yourself. You're not playing on curve necessarily, and then occasionally it's just going to whiff because you may not always kill this right away. You might be forced to play that 2-drop to stay on curve. It just creates all these little awkward situations. So I don't know why you'd ever, you know, compare this to Piloted Shredder, really. It's got the same potential, but also, of course, you lose card advantage with Piloted Reaper where you didn't with Piloted Shredder. So although this can be more consistent in the quality of the minion that you draw from your hand, it's far less good in a lot of other ways. Sacrificing cards, sacrificing, you know, curve some of the time, and often just sacrificing the death rattle altogether. So some really strict limitations on this card make it look merely okay to me instead of like absolutely stupendous like Piloted Shredder was back in the day. So up next here for Warrior, we have Rocket Boots, a new spell at 2 mana. Great artwork. It says give a minion rush and draw a card. And you know what? I think this is a completely fine little card. Just cycling for 2 mana sometimes for Warrior is important. We've seen that with Slam in the past. And much like Slam would set up other plays and options, Rocket Boots is going to do the exact same sort of thing. As long as you have a minion that you can play, you can cast this. And remember, you can even cast this on an enemy minion. So if you're in a desperate pinch, it will still work to draw you a card. It does not say unfriendly minion. And what that means is it's just reliable cycle that sometimes gives something rush in a pretty exciting way. So I don't know exactly what deck or type of warrior wants to run this necessarily, but it's the exact kind of card that can just be slotted in and work and do what you need it to do. So I think this absolutely can and will be played. And then up next we have Wally, or I mean the Rusty Recycler, the 5 mana 2/6 mech here with Taunt and Lifesteal. And you know what? This card has a lot to work with in a mech environment. It's got a pretty solid stat line for 5 mana. It's not quite a Fin Creeper, right? But it's still a lot of health to work with, particularly in combination with Lifesteal. This can pay back a lot when it comes to defense. And when you start thinking about magnetizing this thing, then it becomes really scary with that lifesteal. So for a defensively designed card, it looks like it has a lot of defensive potential. So not every mech deck's going to want to run this. You know, if it's an aggro deck, they're probably not looking for Rusty Recycler. And frankly, even control decks might not have room for this if they're built along a mech line. But coming off of Dr. Boom's Discover, for instance, this is the kind of card that you'll often be excited to see when you're trying to stabilize a game late. And that way, in that way, it has some relevance, even if it's not a perfect constructed format card, still a fine card by design that you won't be unhappy to see. And then up next here we have the Spark Drill, 6 mana 5/1 mech with Rush and Death Rattle. Add 2 1/1 sparks with Rush to your hand. So in some ways this is like our Rager we saw previously, but unfortunately coming at 6 mana, this one's a lot harder to work with in my mind. You just can't flex it into quite as many things. You can't play with other cards as easily. Also, the death rattle here is not actually affecting the board right away. You have to play those sparks because they go to your hand, which means you're having to commit even more mana to get the upside of the death rattle here. What that means is, to me, this leaves this card a little bit awkward, harder to utilize than the Rager, and less good than the Rager, so I don't think this is going to see play. And then up next here is the Spark Engine, a 2-mana 2/1 mech with a battle cry. Add a 1/1 Spark with Rush to your hand. And much like our previous card here for the Engine, the fact that that Spark is going to your hand and you have to spend money on it again, or mana on it again, that's a problem here because the 2-mana 2/1's just not exciting enough. And the upside of that extra card in your hand doesn't matter at all. So Spark Engine just looks very weak, slow for its cost, and unfortunately not a very good card. And then up next here we have Kurd Lightning, a 0-mana spell for Shaman that deals 1 damage to all minions. So this is a Whirlwind card, but it overloads for 2. So it's a 2-mana Whirlwind, which makes it worse than Warrior's Whirlwind. It also makes it worse than the old staple Maelstrom Portal, because remember, this does damage your own minions, and it's the same cost, and you don't get a dude out of it. So at a base level, this card looks kind of challenging, right? I think there are better options that exist. You'd often rather just have a Lightning Storm in its place because you're not running a symmetrical deck then, or symmetrical effect then. But in an overload deck in particular, I think Kurd Lightning has a little bit more potential, because being able to overload for 0 mana can be really important setting up things like your Snow Fury Giants, for instance, or other overload synergy cards. So keep an eye on this one as an overload card more so than its standalone card. I don't think it's going to see a lot of standalone play, but in overload synergy decks, Kurd Lightning does have a little bit of potential to me. And then up next here we have the Whirly Glider, a 2-mana 2/1 with a battlecry summon, a 0/2 Goblin Bomb. Yet another Goblin Bomb synergy card, but unfortunately, because the Whirly Glider herself is so susceptible at that 1 health mark for 2 mana, I'm not sure this one's going to make sense. There are so many other good cards and options that seem like they're going to be summoning Goblin Bombs all over the place. Hunter makes the most sense for that environment in the first place, and Hunter has lots of other options for 2-mana cards too. So I think the Whirly Glider is just not going to ever really see much play. You're not putting enough instant active stats into the field at a pretty important point on turn 2. This is not something that feels great to play late either, so Whirly Glider just looks weak. And then up next here we have Violet Haze for Rogue, 3-mana spell. Add 2 random Death Rattle cards to your hand. So kind of a, Thought Steal for Rogue, but instead of your opponent's stuff, it's just random Death Rattle cards. And random Death Rattle cards, unfortunately, very weak on average. They're just not good. There's a lot of garbage, low-cost stuff that's not going to pay off. So there's not a whole lot of value in Violet Haze here, and unfortunately it's a value-generating card. Not to mention Death Rattle Rogue. We don't even know if that works yet, and this is only going to be good in some sort of Death Rattle Rogue environment. So a couple really big hurdles for this card to overcome. And at the end of the day, even if Death Rattle Rogue worked perfectly, I still don't even think Violet Haze would necessarily contribute very well to that game plan. So to me, this looks like an incredibly weak card. And then up next here we have the Brainstormer, a 3-mana 3/1, really cool looking artwork, and the battle cry reads gain +1 health for each spell in your hand. And that's an intriguing idea here, like this new mechanic in a way, but unfortunately, as we've seen with some previous cards, I think this idea is kind of at odds with itself. So this is really good, for instance, in maybe a hand mage, but you have a lot of big crazy spells in your hand, and this comes down as like a 3/6 or a 3/8 or a 3/10 even, arguably. But, Twilight Drake is just 87 million times better for only 1 more mana, because that's all cards, not just spells. And the 4 attack is more substantial. So I don't really see this as a Twilight Drake replacement. It's just too susceptible to being much, much smaller. It's not even as an important of a mana cost, I would argue, too, compared to Twilight Drake. Getting that out on 4 is often much more impactful. It's not better in the late game either when you have spare mana. So although this looks a bit like Twilight Drake, it's weaker. It's better in a faster deck, but unfortunately only good in a deck that runs a lot of spells and slower stuff. So it's not a minion-based game plan. A lot of things here just challenge themselves within this card, meaning to me that it's fine. It's just not great. And then finally, one last card, the Bulldozer, which has the best artwork of any card in Hearthstone's history as far as I'm concerned. That is hilarious looking. This is the big mech of the expansion, I guess. 9 mana, 9/7, and it just has Divine Shield. And, this is just one of those cards that exist. It's not going to be played. There's no real way to use this or reason to use this. There are much better, scarier threats, bigger, nastier things at these high mana costs. So, occasionally, again, it's great off Dr. Boom's Discover Hero Power if you need a big threat or something. But most of the time, it's just going to sit there in your collection. Great arena card, probably. in some ways. Probably a little too slow for Arena even, perhaps, but just not a constructed card. It's fine, but it's not gonna be played. And believe it or not, guys, that's it for my detailed reviews. So now let's jump into these quick reviews. Floop's Glorious Gloop is a 4-star card. Florrick's Boom Zuka is a 3-star card. Harbinger Celestia is a 1-star card. Coppertail Impostor is a 3-star card. Skaterbot is a 4-star card. Bronze Gatekeeper is a 4-star card. Research Project is a 2-star card. Tinting Turin is a 4-star card. Mechano Egg is a 3-star card. Glowtron is a 4-star card. Weapons Project is a 3-star card. Spirit Bomb is a 3-star card. Crystallizer is a 3-star card. Nether Soul Buster is a 3-star card. Soul Infusion is a 2-star card. Doubling Imp is a 4-star card. Explodinator is a 2-star card. Test Subject is a 3-star card. Extra Arms is a 2-star card. Astral Rift is a 1-star card. Bomb Toss is a 4-star card. Secret Plan is a 3-star card. Necromechanic is a 3-star card. Dino Mattock is a 4-star card. Glowstone Technician is a 2-star card. Elementary Reaction is a 4-star card. Goblin Prank is a 4-star card. Holomancer is a 1-star card. Kaboom Bot is a 1-star card. Loose Specimen is a 2-star card. Mecca Ruh is a 3-star card. Steel Rager is a 3-star card. Spring Rocket is a 3-star card. Electro Right is a 1-star card. Venom Iser is a 4-star card. Cloakscale Chemist is a 3-star card. Unpowered Mauler is a 1-star card. Crazed Chemist is a 2-star card. Toxicologist is a 3-star card. Damaged Stegatron is a 2-star card. Ecto Man C4 is a 2-star card. Topsy-Turvy is a 4-star card. Microtech Controller is a 2-star card. Piloted Reaper is a 2-star card. Rocket Boots is a 4-star card. Rusty Recycler is a 3-star card. Spark Drill is a 1-star card. Spark Engine is a 1-star card. Kurd Lightning is a 2-star card. Whirly Glider is a 1-star card. Violet Haze is a 1-star card. Brainstormer is a 2-star card. Bulldozer is a 2-star card. And there you go, guys. Every Boomsday Project card has now been reviewed, assuming I didn't miss any somehow along the way. Perhaps I did. And you know what? I don't think we named that many 5-star cards, which is right, by the way. I don't think I should ever name that many 5-star cards. There should only ever be like 5 or 6 in an entire expansion. I don't know how many we named. There were more early on, probably 4 or 5 total. Lots of 4-star cards, though, so far in Boomsday Project. There's a lot of cards I think have a really good chance to make an impact. Lots of 3-star cards, too. We got a lot of the 1-star cards there at the end of the review here, at the end of the reveal. They always dump a bunch of garbage at the end. They're neat cards. I'm glad they exist, but they just don't see constructed play, and that's fine. I don't know that I've identified any like sleeper hits or super dominant cards. That's always going to be a surprise. That's what makes them sleepers. But all in all, really strong expansion. Lots of stuff to work with. Lots of promise. Interesting new mechanics. Neat ideas. Some classes seem better off than others, but that's always going to be the case. We'll have to let it shake out to see what really happens, but I obviously can't wait. That said, I'm always curious to hear what you guys have to say. Share your thoughts on this review and all the others as well in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.